Welcome to another community conversation. I'm Michael Witch for LMC Media, and sharing the screen with me is a longtime resident, a prolific and award-winning author, Amy Nathan. Amy, it's lovely to have you with us today. You've written so much. I mean, anybody who wants to know about your history of writing needs just to go to amynathanbooks.com, which I did, to find out all that you've written after a career as an editor and a writer yourself. But I think what we want to talk about today is I think it's your newest book, is it not, Together?
Right. Mm-hmm.
And this was published just last year.
Right.
And it tells a fascinating story about something that, well, it's important that we understand what it's all about. Plessy versus Ferguson, the 1896, I believe it was, decision by the Supreme Court that established the concept of equal but separate. And the reason that it's so important now is, well, one reason is because LMC is engaged in a program now called The Lines Between Us. And that also deals with what separates us, this concept, this idea that, you know, we've all got our biases and our prejudices, and these are lines that divide us. And your story in Together is a hopeful one, because not only does it tell the story of Plessy versus Ferguson, but it also tells how the descendants of those two people came together and made change, or are making change. They have a foundation, do they not? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Keith Plessy is his great grandfather was a first cousin of Homer Plessy, and Phoebe Ferguson is the great granddaughter of the judge John Howard Ferguson, who ruled against Homer Plessy in 1892, and that led to the Supreme Court case, which, as you said, established the principle of separate but equal, which was the underlying legal justification for more than 50 years of segregation laws in this country, and which still, as the book points out, has impact today, with all the procedures and the policies set up during the Jim Crow era. They still have an impact on life today in so many different ways.
LMC did a Zoom with 4 people in the community around the idea of the lines between us. And I was struck when I listened to Jeffrey King, who was a town councilman, and he was talking about police and a report that his committee issued didn't criticize the town police force, but did have comments about the institution of police,
Right.
and the idea of how the police were originally formed to enforce slave rules.
That's right.
And yeah, and so the beginning of separate and equal has a lot to teach us about that same kind of thing, about the origins of what a lot of people believe is an endemic racism in this country.
Right. The policies that were set up, and with the official approval of the Supreme Court, seemed like that was the policies of this nation for so long, and was embedded in so many policies. One that's of impact here in Westchester is the redlining ideas, and the residential segregation that's so hard to overcome. That has its roots in the Jim Crow era, and the parallels in lingering racial bias, preconceptions of attitudes about different people depending on how they look, is research has shown that those are just sort of embedded in the attitudes in this country, and people have to really work hard to overcome them in their day-to-day interactions. And I think that's what the lines between us is pointing out. You know, things that that really cause difficulty for the young people who are focused, whose stories are told in the lines between us, or maybe things that people who aren't part of that ethnic group wouldn't have been aware of, and you think, oh my gosh, of course, that's terrible. And so it just helps today to just constantly be reminded of these lingering aspects of the Jim Crow era that still are there, and that people have to really work actively to work against. But the other thing that you're saying is that the book also presents a positive element, in that these two people who were direct descendants of the polar opposites in the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. They both were born the same year, 1957, in New Orleans, and they both, the book begins with a chapter describing their childhoods, where they were both quite puzzled and upset by the experiences of racial segregation that they encountered. Both Phoebe Ferguson, a young white girl growing up in New Orleans, and also Keith Plessy, a young black man. And they never met as children. As they said, they lived in different worlds. But they finally met in 2009, and by then they had gradually learned about, Keith Plessy particularly had learned about his ancestors' role in the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. And Phoebe Ferguson had learned enough about civil rights to realize that when she met a man in 2009 at a book signing for a really wonderful book that explains the whole Plessy versus Ferguson decision by Keith Weldon Mesley, called We as Free Men. When she met a man named Plessy, she was just floored, and she began apologizing immediately for slavery and for the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. And Keith said, no, you and I, we weren't alive then. We had the chance to do Plessy and Ferguson, not Plessy versus Ferguson. And they became instant best friends, and then set about in 2009 to form this foundation. And their goal is to show how we can learn from the past to create a more just and equitable future. So that they have, one of the main things that they've done is to put up historical markers around New Orleans of little known but important episodes of Black resistance to the oppression that they were experiencing. So rather than focusing on the oppression, they're focusing on people taking active roles in trying to make things better. And then the most recent thing they've done, which is not in the book, but which we are writing an epilogue to add to printings of the book, they just won a pardon for Homer Plessy, a formal pardon that was voted on unanimously by the Louisiana Pardon Board, which is not often, has very low percentage of requests for pardon that they grant, and very rarely do they have a unanimous approval of a pardon. And it was signed, the pardon was signed on January 5th by Louisiana's Governor, John Bell Edwards. And everyone at the ceremony was pointing out that this doesn't eradicate all the pain and suffering and unfairness of the whole Jim Crow era, but it gives an opportunity to make a new beginning. And they acknowledge, I mean, the district attorney who helped write the pardon application and whose office approved it said that it was important that the office that prosecuted Homer Plessy be the same office to ask for his name to be pardoned, because we all know that Homer Plessy's actions at the time made him guilty of a crime under the law, but it was really the law that was the crime. And so the governor, apologized and said that this was a day that should never have had to happen, a day to pardon Homer Plessy. And but now they both see that as a way of making a new step to move forward, to try to continue to undo the injustices that still exist. So this seems like just a really important book for this moment in our history.
And you introduced our community to Keith Plessy and Phoebe Ferguson. I think it was last year about this time,
right?
Or in the spring. you were invited by the Mamaroneck and Larchmont libraries and it was a Zoom event because of COVID.
Right.
And you were able to have both of them on screen with you to talk in person, tell their story in person, so to speak,
Yeah.
and answer some questions. So that was wonderful, and I'm so glad that you're still at it. Uh, is these are heartwarming stories, especially as we read the headlines in the last few years of things like brutalities and murders and things like that that are sometimes involve the police and but other people. So you're drawn to these good stories. You're drawn to solutions as a historical writer.
Right. Well, yeah, I had written an earlier book in 2011, and then we just came out as a picture book 2 years ago about an episode in Baltimore where I grew up, where the community really came together in 1963. Um, Across all different religious and racial lines and philosophical lines as well. People joined together to protest very rigorously at a segregated amusement park, and managed, after 10 years of trying to end segregation in that park, to achieve that in the summer of 1963. And the first day the park was open to all was the same day as Dr. King's March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, August 28th.
Mhm.
And so from that, working on that story, I became sort of like primed to look for other examples of people coming together and working together. And so when I saw an article in the Washington Post about Keith Plessy and Phoebe Ferguson joining together, and I thought, oh my gosh, that's got to be the ultimate example of people coming together across racial lines. And so that I was determined to find a way to write about them as well.
Well,
But,
I'm
since, yeah.
I was going to say unfortunately we're out of time,
Uh,
but I'm so glad that you reached out to us when you heard about the lines between us and recognized immediately the connection between your story here that you tell and the local effort that LMC Media and Cure, an organization along with the Community Resource Center, are doing in our Larchmont Mamaroneck area. It's been delightful to talk to you. Please come back and talk to us some more about, well, you've written about music and women's history and dance and gosh, there's lots of stuff we could talk about, but thank you for this time today.
well,